Hello, I'm Mark Redd. I'm a PhD candidate at Brigham Young University, and I study autoignition temperatures for the DIPPR 801 project that is headed by the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. And we're very excited today to show you our results of the progress we've made in predicting autoignition temperatures for pure compounds. First, I want to give you an introduction to DIPPR. DIPPR stands for the Design Institute for Physical Properties, and DIPPR maintains the 801 database, which contains pure component thermophysical property data for over 2,300 compounds, and that includes 32 property constants and 15 temperature-dependent properties. Now, DIPPR maintains this database and provides it to sponsors of the database, and maintains quality by following a few guiding principles. First off is the industrial sponsor control. The sponsors get to decide what's in the database. Secondly is a critical evaluation process, which allows high quality data to be selected among all the possible data sources to be recommended to industrial professionals. And thirdly, part of that evaluation process involves trying to ensure consistency among all properties, and also completeness, meaning every compound, where possible, has a complete set of the 32 property constants and 15 temperature-dependent properties. This work has been focused on trying to predict autoignition temperatures, and as such we've reviewed a bunch of different prediction techniques for autoignition temperatures that have come up in the last 30 years. Of these, we've identified at least 6 methods that are artificial neural networks, 4 QSPR methods, or quantitative structure-property relationships, and 3 methods which are group contribution methods. And we've noticed that these methods all have shortcomings in that they fail to capture the complexity of the processes that lead to autoignition temperatures, and all the underlying phenomena that give rise to autoignition temperatures. Many of these prediction methods also fail to use quality data. That is, they'll use any data source they can find, and even some have used predicted data to regress their prediction methods. And that's a problem we've seen over and over again. And then the third problem is that many fail to have any basis in first principles, or even though QSPR approaches that, they fail to capture anything that is related directly to the autoignition temperature process. So we're going to see if we can address those in the material that we're going to present today. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about how autoignition mechanisms work. So when we talk about autoignition temperature, we're talking about the temperature at which a flammable substance will ignite in the presence of oxygen, or in the presence of air rather, without any spark or ignition source. So there are 2 ways of generally looking at this process. The first is called chain branching autoignition, and that has to do with what you see here. This mechanism this simple mechanism for hydrogen, you can see that you start with hydrogen and you break it homolytically to make 2 hydrogen radicals using some heat, and then the hydrogen combines with oxygen to make more radicals, and you get chain branching, which means you're multiplying the number of radicals. And then those recombine, and eventually you get water wherein heat is produced. Now, the way of approaching the chain branching autoignition point of view is that you're focusing on the concentration of radicals and how that reaches a critical limit, at which point you get a runaway reaction. So it's all based on how many radicals are being generated versus how many are terminating or propagating. Now, contrast that to a thermal autoignition, which has more to do with where the focus is on the energy balance. The energy balance has more to do with the amount of heat generation as water is produced in this particular case, versus how much heat is being dissipated out to the environment. In either case, once the concentration of radicals or the generation of heat exceeds that which is dissipated, you reach a condition where a runaway reaction can take place, and you get an ignition event which takes the form of a visible flame or explosion of some sort. The second problem we are trying to address is the idea of data quality. Now, to explain this, I've put up a plot here of a bunch of different data sources that show autoignition temperatures for the normal alkanes. You can see it's plotted, the x-axis being carbon number. So at number 1 you have methane, ethane, propane, and so on down. And then the observed autoignition temperatures. Now, you can see that depending on the data source, you can see quite a large spread in the autoignition temperatures that are observed. In a particular case, butane has a very large spread of 100 degrees or more. the important thing about understanding data quality is that we're trying to make a method of predicting autoignition temperatures that makes it consistent with standardized experimental methods. In this case, we would be trying to make it standardized with the ASTM E659 method, which is the current accepted method for measuring autoignition temperature. So you can see that if you try to go through and vet these data and try to pick only those data that are consistent with the ASTM method, you get something like the following. From this plot, you can see that each of these points represent an autoignition temperature that is consistent and is the lowest point that is consistent with the ASTM E659 method. And this ensures that when you regress a prediction method based on these data, you're more likely to approach a prediction method that will more accurately predict autoignition temperature according to standardized methods. Today we would like to present a new method that before now has never been known to the public. It is called the Seaton method. It was created by the late Dr. William H. Seaton. And originally he produced this method and distributed it as software. And very kindly, his son, who now holds the copyright, was kind enough to help us understand and provide the source code so that we could understand the method, and we are getting ready to improve upon it and publish it. So the method is based on first principles and uses a non-explicit equation to model autoignition temperatures based on probabilities, which is a very consistent way with what we have observed in our experimental work, a very consistent way of predicting autoignition temperatures. First, I would like to describe what assumptions are built into this model of autoignition temperatures. First off, the model assumes that the equivalence ratio is 1, or the fuel-to-air ratio is at a stoichiometric level. Secondly, the absolute pressure is 1 atmosphere. This is an important distinction, as many experimental methods do not necessarily have their experiments taking place at 1 atmosphere absolute pressure, but this is a consistent way of doing so. The model assumes that that compounds are composed of several second-order groups, and that a single oxygen atom comes in and collides with one of those groups and leads to radical formation, which results in ignition. And the probability of that occurring can be described, or can be associated with a probability which we are going to call PI. Now, if we observe each of these probabilities, we assume that they are all mutually exclusive, and therefore they can be summed up, and where they sum to 1, that should be the autoignition temperature. Therefore, each of these probabilities is a function of autoignition temperature. And so the sum equal to 1, that's your autoignition temperature. So the next is to explain what each of these probabilities are. First, we have the probability associated with the concentration of fuel in air. Now, I mentioned before that this is assuming the fuel-to-air ratio is stoichiometric. Therefore, this turns out to be constant and is only dependent on the structure of the molecule to figure out how many oxygen atoms are needed to completely combust the molecule in a stoichiometric ratio. Therefore, what we have here is we multiply the mole fraction of fuel by the mole fraction of oxygen, and we add a constant in there to control for that. The second probability has to do with collision flux. Now, those that are familiar with kinetic theory understand that collision flux is proportional to the square root of temperature. Therefore, we add a constant on the front, and that becomes our second probability in collision flux. The third probability is related to the Arrhenius expression, where the frequency factor is a constant, and the other parameter that may be used is the activation energy, and we can see that that's related to temperature as well. The fourth has to do with multiple instances of a particular second-order group being present in the molecule. Of course, when we talk about this model, we say only 1 oxygen leads to ignition. So therefore, to control for the addition of multiple groups being present, we have to control the probability and say it hits one of them, but none of the others. And that basically equates itself to a probability of ignition and the exclusive OR logic that applies to each of those individual instances of the group. So, combining all of these together, we see that we multiply, that each of these probabilities has to occur in sequence, and they are all non-mutually exclusive. Therefore, they're multiplied together in the sort of AND logic that probabilities of that nature take. And so P1 times P2 times P3 times P4, we combine all those, combine all the constants that we can, and we are left with this equation at the bottom, which has parameters D, P, and E for every single group in the in the molecule. And the autoignition temperature is inserted to every place where there's temperature to complete the equation and ensure that the equation is consistent with the model. The next part is to see how the Seaton method performs against other methods. We have a number of methods available to us, and we were able to compare some of the more prominent ones against the Seaton method and see how they measured up. The data set selected was 167 data from 105 different unique hydrocarbons, and these were regressed with the Seaton method with an 80% testing set and a 20% training set. And so this training, the 20% training set of that 167 data point set is what we're looking at here. We can see that we've compared it against the Chebeco method, the Pintar method, and the Albari method. And we've also compared a simplified Seaton method that removes a lot of the exceptions Seaton had in his original code versus the original Seaton. And what we see from this plot is that the Seaton method, even the simplified method with all the exceptions removed, both perform much better than any previous method that came before it. And the absolute average deviation is around 3 to 5%, where all the other ones are much larger. And you can see that also in the bias on the right, that the bias is very large in one direction or another, where the original Seaton method has very little bias and pretty much rides the center line down the data set. A further comparison of the Seaton method performance shows that the Seaton simplified method was regressed with the intent that for some of the larger errors that you see in the original Seaton method, we were able to perform a little bit better. You can see some of that at around some of the larger variances here. We have the experimental autoignition temperature and the estimated one based on the different methods. Both of these perform very well, but we have been able to improve in minor ways. And so we expect that we'll be able to improve in many other ways as we make changes moving forward. I want to talk about the improvements we hope to make to the Seaton method. One of the first things we would like to do is look at the equation and perhaps revise the equation form. First off, we want to control for the correlated parameters, D and P. You can see them in red there. Both of these parameters can be multiplied together, and therefore they're very correlated. We would either want to break that correlation or otherwise combine those two into one parameter. And secondly, we want to reconsider some of the assumptions that are made in the Seaton method. For example, XF times XO, that has to do with the stoichiometric fuel-to-air ratio. Some literature suggests that stoichiometric fuel-to-air ratio is not ideal for autoignition events to occur. So we may have to revisit that and rethink that. And we also expect to add and revise some of the functional groups and hopefully improve the fit by adding more, and also revising how some of them are regressed and how some of them are put together. And then, of course, finally, like we've said before, we want to use quality data in both our training and testing sets so we get the most consistent and accurate and robust version of the Seaton method that we can. So to conclude, the Seaton's model is obviously an improved approach to predicting the AIT for its ability to at least partially capture the complexity of the autoignition process, and also to be based on first principles and have an actual model of what's happening in an autoignition environment. And we have already shown that with some modifications we can get improved performance, and we expect to do that as we move along here. So our future work will involve evaluating the best data for regression. We hope to have a set of 490 compounds for regression and to produce our final product. And then we, of course, want to, as we said before, revise the equation and improve on the groups, and hopefully expand the Seaton method to make it more useful to engineers and scientists everywhere. Finally, I want to acknowledge all those who made this work possible. First off, the sponsors of the DIPPR 801 project for providing funding for this research. Secondly, I cannot overstate how helpful and powerful the foundational work of Dr. William H. Seaton has been, and we are also grateful to his son Glenn Seaton for providing the source code and helping us understand his father's work. And finally, I'd like to recognize the undergraduates who participated in the project, helping us regress the new version of the equation, and also help us organize the groups. That includes Joe Black, Cassandra Guffey, and Colin Anderson. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope I can respond to any questions you have.